Right here, I have the cheapest Gen 4 NVMe SSD you can currently buy, the Kingston NV2. For the 1TB version, you will have to spend about $50 or about 50 euros here in Europe, or a little bit over $100 or 100 euros for the 2TB version, which is actually very cheap. Now, I did reach out to Kingston to see if they would send out a sample for me to test, but they were actually only interested in reviews of their high-end model, the Fury Renegade, and not at all in reviews of this cheap NV2 drive, which kind of made me want to review it even more, so I just bought one on Amazon. Let's see how it performs and why Kingston doesn't want people talking about these. Let's begin. The NV2 drive comes in capacities ranging from 250 GB up to 2 TB, but since 250 GB SSDs are slower and the price per gigabyte is much higher, you should probably just ignore anything under 500 GB nowadays. The drive itself is super simple. All the memory is on one side, which is nice for cooling and for laptop compatibility. There's no heatsink included, and there are no heat-sinked options either, but I will talk more about temperatures a bit later in this video. The problem with cheap SSDs is that manufacturers often set extremely low standards. So if you look at the website, the specs here are very basic. There is a pretty low sequential read and write performance listed, but nothing else is specified. And that kind of means that they will make these NV2s with whatever parts are the cheapest at the moment, as long as it meets these very low requirements. And keep in mind, it will be pretty hard not to meet them. And if I look online, some models were reported to have 3-bit and some 4-bit memory, and none of them have DRAM cache like you would find on higher-end drives. So I would say it is a bit inconsistent. There are a few other signs of cost cutting here. You get a 3-year-long warranty instead of 5, and 5 years has become the standard nowadays. And you don't get any cloning software with the drive, although I still think a clean install is highly recommended if you're going to use this as an operating system drive. The packaging is also very basic, but that is completely irrelevant and perfectly fine if you ask me. But let's jump straight into what really matters, which is the performance. And as always, I'm going to begin with the PC Mark X Quick Benchmark, which is a collection of tests that replicate all those little light things that we do with our PCs every single day, like working with various documents or looking at photos, for example. And this is a great benchmark for anyone that wants to add some extra storage to their system for these simple little tasks. And the NV2 actually looks pretty good here. It is just ahead of Crucial's P3 Plus and Samsung's 980, and it is far ahead of the WD Blue SN570, and keep in mind, all these drives do cost more. It is not even that far from the 980 Pro in this test, but it is well behind mid-range and high-end Gen 4 SSDs like the Crucial P5 Plus or Kingston's own KC3000, and of course, it is far behind the 990 Pro. The full PC Mark X suite is more intense, and it is supposed to replicate a more consistent, more intense and more serious use of your system and of the drive itself. And this is a very useful benchmark for anyone that is looking for a new main drive, or for anyone that needs to run some various applications that can be heavy on the SSD, like video editing, for example. And the NV2 does drop a bit here, but it is still ahead of the SN570 and way faster than even the fastest SATA SSD. The MP600GS, P3 Plus and the Samsung 980 are now ahead of it, but only by a small margin, which, given the lower price of the NV2, doesn't seem that bad at all. Looking at the latency result, you get the same image. It is just behind the 980, P3 Plus and the MP600GS. Even though the PC Mark consistency test is not really relevant for most of you, it is always interesting to see how a drive behaves under an extreme multi-hour workload that stresses the drive to its very limits. I mean, this doesn't happen in most regular use cases, and affordable drives like this one should not be bought for these situations anyways. So it's not really a surprise that the NV2 really struggled in this test, even falling behind the 870 EVO. But it is still ahead of the Samsung 980. As I said, if you care about storage-intense applications, you should be buying one of the drives in the top half of this graph, not the bottom. Gaming, on the other hand, is the main reason to actually buy a large affordable SSD, and this 3D Mark storage benchmark is a combination of tests that include a lot of gaming-related tasks. Those are the things like loading games, installing games, recording games, saving games, as well as moving game folders around. And here as well, the NV2 did fall behind the drives it was competing with before, even the Gen 3 ones. But if I look at the gaming results that I personally find most important, so loading times, installation times, and update times, it looks all pretty similar. It scores about 57% of the performance of the fastest drive I've tested so far, the SN850X, and that puts it yet again a bit behind the P3 Plus, and even the Gen 3 980 and SN570 do considerably better. Sequential read and write performance doesn't really represent a proper real-life use as well as previous tests, but it is still worth checking if this drive meets the speed that they claim in their spec sheet. In sequential reads, it scores just over 3,500 megabytes per second. Now that kind of meets the advertised speed, but it is also more in line with Gen 3 SSDs because Gen 4 ones are usually faster. It is also way below Sony's recommended spec for the PS5, so I would not consider this drive for PlayStation 5 use. Sequential writes came in at 2,468 megabytes per second, matching the Samsung 980 exactly. Now that is more than the advertised spec of 2,100 megabytes per second, and it is definitely a lot better than the SN570, which completely tanks when writing larger datasets. But most Gen 4 SSDs do a lot better here. Thermals of the NV2 are not a problem if you stick to that light use or to gaming, but when you really stress the drive by writing tens of gigabytes of data to it, it can actually get pretty hot. While the internal sensors only reported about 70 degrees Celsius during the stress test, the FLIR camera actually reported 93 degrees, and it was way too hot to touch. Now, since I wouldn't really recommend this drive for any intense use to begin with, thermals should not really be an issue, but I still think that putting it under the heatsink of your motherboard or getting a third-party heatsink is just a much better thing to do. I will leave some suggestions for the third-party models in the description of this video. So the NV2 is far from being an impressive SSD. On one hand, sequential performance is more in line with Gen 3 drives, and for gaming workloads, some Gen 3 drives actually do slightly better. But on the other hand, it is really hard to ignore how cheap this drive is. Even if you're looking at it as a Gen 3 drive, it still offers a lot of value. If we look at US prices, it is cheaper than the Gen 3 SN570 and the Samsung 980. The P3 Plus is the strongest alternative in this list, and it is worth paying a bit more for it, but you typically need to spend $25 more for the 2TB version, which might be a lot to some people. Then again, if I look at the prices today, the P3 Plus is actually on a very nice special, so definitely check the current prices in your region before making a decision, because with this discount, the P3 Plus currently makes more sense. If I look at the prices here in Holland, for example, it looks quite similar. Again, I would say that the P3 Plus is probably worth considering if you can spend a bit more, as its performance is a bit more consistent, but compared to the SN570 or the Samsung 980, this NV2 offers generally similar levels of performance for much less money. I mean, the 1TB 980 is actually priced close to the 2TB NV2, which makes it a no-brainer. So at the end of the day, it is important to remember that the NV2 did well in both PCMark 10 tests, which do simulate most day-to-day use cases. So even if it's not a top-tier performer, it is actually kind of okay. Given the price, I would say it even does better than I expected it to, and I don't really see a reason why Kingston wouldn't want reviewers to test this drive. So just don't buy it for a high-end Photoshop or video editing workstation, and if you don't need that extra performance and you just want some affordable extra storage, this Kingston NV2 is completely fine. This video is brought to you by Seasonic and their Prime TX power supplies. These fully modular, high-quality power supplies are extremely efficient. They are very quiet due to their new hybrid fan control that stops the fans completely under 40% load. They offer a variety of connections for any kind of systems you have in mind, and you even get the new 12-volt high-power connection you need for the brand new RTX 4090 graphics cards from NVIDIA. They range from 650 watts all the way up to 1600 watts for the biggest enthusiasts out there, and as a nice bonus, you get a cozy 12-year-long warranty. Check them out using the links in the description below. That is all I have for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, do consider pressing that subscribe button to never miss my future uploads. Bye guys, and see you in the next one.